Hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, senior film writer for Now Magazine, and this is the other thing I do. My guest this week is Vincenzo Natali, a writer and director whose feature films include Cube, Cypher, Nothing, Splice, and Haunter, and whose television work ranges from Orphan Black, Westworld, and The Strain to Luke Cage, American Gods, and the best episodes of Brian Fuller's Hannibal. He's also an old friend. We first met about 30 years ago when I was at York University studying film with Vince's high school friend and future Cube screenwriter, Andrei Bajalik. And now, every time we run into each other professionally, it's a little weird. So it was really nice to just sit down and talk about a movie like we used to. Vince picked Blade Runner, Ridley Scott's era-defining 1982 sci-fi film noir, which stands as one of the most influential projects of its day. 35 years ago, though, it was seen as a weird, frustrating Harrison Ford detective thriller with robots, brutality, and admittedly astonishing set design. And it confused critics, alienated audiences, and took years to find its proper status, rolling through a series of competing director's cuts until the release of the definitive edition in 2007, and now returning to the conversation with the advent of Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049. So, what better time to release this episode? Just for a little context, we recorded this back in June, and for some reason there was a lot of helicopter traffic in the neighborhood that day. It kind of works for the overall dystopian feel. You'll see. This is Someone Else's Movie.
Because we're anticipating the sequel, that's kind of a nice time to talk. But no, I don't know why that was the first thing that sprung to mind. Maybe because I was another podcast I wanted to do it and someone else got it, but also it's easy for me because it's a film I have fairly extensive knowledge of,
right?
But it always amazes me, especially having worked in that realm a bit, and that movie does not age.
It's funny, it used to be that if you made a period piece in the past, set something in the past, and it's timeless. It doesn't look, except for maybe some of the 60s war movies that look like they were shot in 1964. Right. Usually, if you try to make a future, it doesn't work because you'll find something that will date itself. And just like old Star Trek versus new Star Trek, even not just the 60s series, but the 80s movies where everything is limited by what they had available. And yeah, there are two films, Blade Runner and Minority Report, where it feels like it's coming instead of invented.
Well, one of the strokes of genius in Blade Runner is that Ridley Scott or somebody realized that fashion is cyclical. Mm-hmm. So by resurrecting 1940s style fashion, that was a very natural thing for the way society and culture evolves. And then he's totally right. Yeah. And it just has a grit to it. Like I was watching it again, and then it's also because it preceded digital effects work, and so everything's done for real and done so well because Douglas Trumbull did all the visual effects. But it just has a tactile quality to it that very few science fiction films have, and a believable one. Like the future will be as dirty as it is now. It's not going to be a clean place, and so I think for all those reasons, it feels very correct. And not that it needs to be correct, but it doesn't. I mean, actually, it's a kind of a curse because anyone trying to make a science fiction film now has that movie to compete with. Like, that's the high watermark for great science fiction visual design, and I don't really think anyone's ever surpassed it. And that's, how old is it now? 1982. That's
82. It's
36
years old.
36
years.
Yeah,
I don't like thinking about these things. What really strikes me about the design is that it all somehow still services the noir aspect of it, the story, the neo-noir, where it's actually neon noir. There's a look, there's a loneliness to the way everything is framed. It's one of the movies I'm constantly in conflict with because it's not perfect in the way that people want it to be, but it is perfect in other ways. Like the story is slow, the pacing is sluggish. Scott is way too interested in fans. It's a motif that it just keeps coming back.
Right.
And it's a little bit too much in love with its own design, but at the same time, we are marveling at it. So I don't mind having the time in the frame to just gawk at things and stare at the constructions. But the themes are amazing, and the performances are way better than people give them credit for.
Oh, yeah.
And, I mean, I remember seeing it initially, and then again in 92 when it came back in the theatrical, in the final cut, which wasn't the final cut. Because Ridley Scott won't stop recutting it, or wouldn't for a while, I was constantly given the opportunity to see it again in a theater properly in an age where all you had was VHS and Laserdisc, and you just do not get the visual impact of this film on a television. I mean, you can now. We finally caught up to it. But it's the sort of experience that you really, just as we were talking earlier about Netflix versus theatrical, you need to be locked in the dark with this film to really sink into it. Otherwise, you're just staring at pictures waiting for something to happen. Yeah.
No, I think it's kind of a VR experience. Like, I feel that, like, there's a few movies of that time. The Shining is one for me. Apocalypse Now is another, where narratively, I think you could say they're imperfect, or they're things that are flawed about them. But it almost doesn't matter, because those movies so completely transport you to those places that you really feel like they exist beyond the borders of the frame.
Yeah.
And Blade Runner is definitely one of them. So they're almost, and I don't mind that. Like, in a way, I'm almost glad there isn't too much narrative. I know that people criticize Blade Runner because it's supposed to be a detective story, and there's really not much detecting going on.
Yeah, I remember someone complaining about Deckard constantly just getting beaten up instead of asking questions.
Right.
He just gets punched before he can do anything. But that actually works. That's, The Maltese Falcon is not about a guy who knows what's going on. It's
no, that's a good point.
Stumbling into the truth.
That's true. And Harrison Ford takes a punch really, really well.
Yeah.
There's that... He just does. He's really... I mean, it's a very funny film in an odd way at points, too. In very strange ways. Mm-hmm. But there's that moment when he... At the very end, where he's holding onto that girder and he lets go and he just spits out something from his mouth. Like, he's really good at that kind of visceral performance. But
I derailed you, though. You were saying.
I have no idea what I was saying. That in some ways, had it been overly interested in the mystery, like if it were a little more like Chinatown, I'm not sure that... First of all, I'm not just sure the film could contain that, because there's so much going on conceptually and thematically and visually that if it became too watered down with plot details and twists and turns, I'm not sure I would like that movie. Personally, I'm not sure I would like that movie as much.
Yeah.
And there's just something, the languid pace of it, and also it's just the tone of it. It's very melancholy. It's very romantic and melancholy, even though it's the prototypical cyberpunk film. It's actually a very romantic film, and that's what I take away from it. It's that sort of tarnished world that you're entering that is so beautiful and hideous at the same time, that to me is what I enjoy about the movie. I certainly don't actually, watching it again recently, I was struck by the fact that it's not a detective story. I mean, it's a bounty hunter story.
That's true. Yeah,
he's just hunting these people. Like, there's no mystery. In fact, I guess it's a flaw that when Bryant, who's Deckard's boss, shows him the videos of the Nexus 6, I mean, I don't know why they're giving them Voight Comp tests, because they have videos of what they look like. That's not really, but the point being that I think it's not about uncovering a mystery at all. It's much more a story about what it means to be human, and in fact, that's the core of it. What does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to be alive?
Yeah.
And I guess Ridley Scott's brother had died shortly before he made the film.
Which brother was this?
He had. I don't know much about it. He had a third brother, and he died. I hope I have this story straight, but he was doing Dune with De Laurentiis, and he dropped out of Dune because his brother died. And then he did Blade Runner. Uh-huh. So, if that's the true story, it makes a lot of sense, because the film is it's all about death.
Yeah.
And it's so sad in so many ways. So, so I think I think Blade Runner suffered from the misunderstanding that it was an updated detective story, because it's not. I mean, it is in terms of its milieu and the atmosphere and so on, but in terms of the plot, it really isn't.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of that is no longer operative thanks to the removal of the narration. I mean, that really
Right.
brought it in line with every other noir, every other pulp story, and it gives you that wonderful anecdote about Harrison Ford just refusing to participate and being cranky, but it still works because the Harrison Ford we know now is cranky and short-tempered, and that voiceover instantly plugs you into a type of Harrison Ford movie that it isn't.
Right.
It's not and coming a year after Raiders too, it's not an action film. It's got chases, but it's not, your pulse never really elevates. That's not the kind of movie it is.
Right.
That Vangelis score at the very beginning is just telling you to sink back and be passive in this experience.
I actually remember the first time I saw it vividly, even though I guess I was 13.
Yeah, I would.
It would probably be about the same age, right? And
I was still 13 at that point in '82. Yeah, I saw it at the Willow on a double feature with Firefox.
wow,
Yeah,
that's an interesting double bill.
That was a Sunday.
I saw it. I just remember. I don't know why, but I remember it so vividly. I saw it. I think the Saturday after it had opened, so it opened Friday. I saw it the Saturday matinee, and the theater was full of teenage girls. And when Harrison Ford's name came up on the screen, they all screamed. And boy, were they disappointed. They were not happy after the movie was over. Because, of course, it was the first film he had done since Raiders. So everyone was, even though it was a science fiction film, it was sort of harkened back to that period. And I think people were expecting sci-fi Raiders, and it is definitely not that.
Oh, yeah.
But I thought at there was a theater that doesn't exist anymore called the Imperial Six.
Oh yeah.
And I remember it was a matinee, and I remember coming out of the film, and it was kind of rainy. Imperial Six was on Yonge Street, which is a big street in Toronto, for those who don't know. And it was rainy out, and the Imperial Six had these weird, if I remember correctly, it had these like weird circular kind of windows or lights on it. And it kind of looked a bit like a set from Blade Runner. And I really felt like, in the best possible way, I'm still in the movie. It had such an impact on me, and everything that was going on outside the theater had just a very similar quality. I'll never forget it. But then I was shocked. I loved the movie when I saw it. But then I was shocked. It was completely trashed.
Yeah.
J. Scott, who is a very important critic here, wrote a vicious review of it, and
yeah,
I remember
it's still on the shelf behind you in one of his books, and I remember just being struck by. It's not that he didn't like it; it's that he rejected it aggressively, as did a few other critics at the time. Just like nobody wanted it to be what it was. Everybody wanted it to be something else. Even me describing it just now as noir. It's not that, but that's where I can format it. That's where I can put it in my head.
Right.
But
you're so right.
It's such an unexpected sort of film, and what struck me thinking about it, just getting ready for this, was that the two big sci-fi bombs, the films that were perceived as big failures in 1982 in the summer, right? There's Blade Runner and The Thing, and they're both about the same story. They're both about people trying to figure out what they are and who they are,
right?
And whether they're human or not. And now you look back on them as classics,
right?
And high watermarks really for that sort of storytelling, but then no one accepted them.
I wonder if if Blade Runner had been released at a different time the same year, if it wouldn't have done better, because it came out the week after E.T. or just shortly. Or I don't know, maybe not that close after.
No, it was
E.T.
right around.
It was very close.
That tiny window of time was
right.
E.T. and The Thing and Blade Runner and Poltergeist. And you have this fight between a commercial cinema, a commercial genre cinema that is also deeply feeling-based, I guess, more than anything else. Both of those films are incredibly emotional rides. And then you have Blade Runner and The Thing, which are much more austere in their storytelling methods, and which people just didn't want. I mean, they were resoundingly rejected.
Yeah. And this is what's so amazing to me, is I wonder, and I don't know how you would ever quantify this, but which films ended up being more influential. And I'd certainly be willing to say Blade Runner was or is as influential on the culture as E.T., and probably more so.
Yeah, it definitely resulted in better imitations. Like E.T., you know, E.T. is so singular that, you know, you get Mac and Me. You get films that...
Short Circuit.
Yeah, the films that are... They take the wrong things away from the story. It's not the visuals, it's not the emotional immersion, it's the pandering and the cute sidekicks and the adorability. And then... Or the other thing that came out of Poltergeist, which was the Spielberg kids in danger kind of thing that ran through. I mean, yes, you get the Goonies and Back to the Future and a couple of the other Amblin productions, but then you also get everything else like Adventures in Babysitting and My Science Project and all that weird science stuff, including Weird Science. All those films that just ape the thing without actually understanding the thing. And Blade Runner, you get a generation of filmmakers coming away scratching their chins and thinking, well, how can I make a movie about these big themes that still works on a narrative level?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think and in the way it just influenced fashion and things outside of cinema, like just the and
design alone,
design and then just our own perception of our society, the way things are headed. That film, I mean, it certainly wasn't the first one to do it, but it definitely struck a chord in terms of anticipating globalization and anticipating climate change and presenting a very stark picture of what the future might be.
Yeah. I was trying to think about this. Is this the first movie that takes the concept of an off-world colony seriously? That people are leaving Earth? I mean, there are Twilight Zone episodes where the world is going to end, but those are much more immediate. This one has that sort of sense of a slow decline. That by this point,
so. I think you're probably right.
Yeah, because there's Total Recall and there's a bunch of other stuff, but those are all subsequent.
And also based on Philip K. Dick.
That's true. The pessimism is definitely one you can feel.
For sure. I reread the book. I read the book like when I was a teenager, and then I reread it, I'm going to guess, at least 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. And then I read the Wikipedia synopsis of it before I came here and realized I remembered nothing from the book. But the book's really great. Yeah. It's a wonderfully, it's just a much, but it's very, I mean, it's much more satirical. I would love to see the Terry Gilliam version of this well, because it's much more screwball and satirical and manic than the movie is. But all of that stuff is there. The off-world colonies is there. The environmental degradation of the earth and mass extinctions. All of that's very deeply part of the book. I'm fascinated by the whole adaptation process in general, and Blade Runner in particular, because I feel like the book and the film are very, very different in many, many ways, and yet it's actually a great adaptation. And they feel like they're of the same thing, and yet very, very different. But for instance, the replicants in the book they're actually not empathetic. That's the whole point. They represent something else entirely. In the film, they're probably the most human characters in the movie, but aside from Deckard. But in the book, they're not. They have no empathy. That's why they have an empathy test for them. So it's doing, or it's interpreting certain. The film is interpreting certain aspects of the book very differently than I think they were intended. But at the end of the day, they do feel like they meet again.
Yeah, it dovetails in a way.
It dovetails, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really. I haven't read the book in decades. Most likely, I think I picked it up when I still probably have the movie novelization cover version that is the original short novel. But I think the last time I had a run on Philip K. Dick, I read that, so it would have been maybe, I don't know, before Paycheck came out anyway. But that was the last time I really thought about it. And it reads like a feverish version of the movie, but the spirit of the film is the spirit of the book somehow. You're absolutely right. It's an inquiry. Like it wants to know more. Both book and film are consumed with the idea of understanding this thing, this circumstance. It's not even the replicants themselves. It's the chain reaction that led to them. And I think with Dick, he's trying to unpack how we could get there. And with Deckard, it's about, with Scott, with Fancher, the movie is about someone trying to figure out what happens next and what it means that these guys are here, as opposed to how did the world become so corrupted and cynical that this is what we ended up doing.
I think that's a really good observation.
Why, thank you. But the and then the film, you were saying that in the movie they're much more empathetic. I think it's impossible to make a slave narrative, which is ultimately where they come from, and not side with the slaves on some level for a filmmaker, because once you cast them and work with the actors, you see them, and it's a thing that the book can't do, or the book doesn't have to do, because they're abstracted by text, and the minute you have to figure out, you actually have to confront the fact that you are making people move around in the frame, and I'm sure this has happened for you with stuff that's not human or supernatural or extra normal. You're dealing with a thing like nothing. How do you build nothing? Because you have to tell that story with minimal resources, but also where nothing is a resource, where the lack of things is a resource. But the idea for Scott, I can only imagine what it must have been like, realizing that you're building the wardrobe and the makeup and the hair for people who have never had any attention paid to them because they're just workers. And created to do this, and that completely changes the way the film's perspective sits.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
That was a long way of going there.
No, but I think that is right. I think there's a funny trend these days to have ultra faithful adaptations of very popular books.
Yeah,
and it's considered sacrilege to change anything. And I think that's really wrong-headed, because at the end of the day, you could have a letter-perfect translation of something like Stephen King's miniseries based on The Shining and completely miss the point of the book.
Right, yeah.
And, I actually find going back to The Shining again for some reason, those two films, I guess, are linked in a number of ways. But I also feel like The Shining, I haven't read the book since I was a kid, but I feel like The Shining departs from the book radically, but it, again, dovetails, comes back to the same place, and is in some ways, in essence, like very, very faithful to the book.
Yeah. Well, Kubrick gets the existential horror at the heart of the book, which is being locked in a space with something that wants to hurt you.
Right.
Even though you're the thing that is trying to hurt people. I mean, it's amazing, because The Shining is an externalized observational story of Jack Torrance, and the book is basically in his head the whole time.
Right.
But we still end up in the same place. It's just kind of put off on other characters and recontextualized in a way that lets that story play as a movie. But you're right, books aren't movies. You have to be different. You have to at least understand what's different about the medium as you tell your story.
Yeah, I think so. It's an interesting, in other words, to be faithful to something, you have, I think, not always, but frequently you have to be unfaithful.
Yeah.
And you
have to be willing to be, at least.
Or you have to be willing to, yeah. And I'm sure that, I think that's part of Blade Runner's success. And I was also struck when I was rereading the Wikipedia synopsis, because I, again, totally forgot all of this, that it being a Philip K. Dick book, it obsesses about whether Rick Deckard is a replicant or not.
Right.
So I don't think anybody, or very few people, I don't want to say anybody, very few people thought about that initially when they watched the movie in 1982.
Yeah, no,
I don't think it was really brought up. But then when the first director's cut came out, it was a deal, because Ridley Scott introduced this whole idea of the unicorn.
Yeah, oh no, he made it explicit.
And then there was a furor there was a rebellion against that idea. Like, how dare they, of course Rick Decker's a human, because people identified with Harrison Ford and thought that was it. I think a lot of people, maybe myself to some degree, felt, oh, well, that's a very tacked on idea. But it's in the book. Yeah. Like, it's a big part of the book. There's a whole, Deckard meets a police station full of what he thinks are policemen, all turn out to be replicants, and then they begin to question whether he's a replicant, and it becomes an ongoing obsession. And then the whole book ends with him discovering this frog, and then it's revealed to actually be a robotic frog. So it's constantly flip-flopping. And anyway, it's just interesting to me that was in the DNA of the novel to begin with, and not something that was added later.
Yeah, and there's that line that Gaff has too, "You've done a man's job," which I think is supposed to be future slang, but just sounds like he's talking to someone who isn't a man. It's
right.
It's just one of those choices. There's so many choices that are ambiguous at best and misleading at worst while you're watching it. I mean, and it takes, I would say, 5 or 6 viewings to pick them all up, just because after a while you have nothing else to do but listen. You stop looking and you start listening to how people are talking and what they're saying. And there's all this stuff that's in the film that feels like it's supposed to create a larger universe outside of the frame. Like, they call you Mr. Nighttime, they call you Blade Runner. No one calls them those things, ever. It never comes up.
Yeah, right.
Is someone, and then you start wondering, is somebody reinforcing a false memory that's been planted? I mean, if he's a Nexus 6, he would have to be a Nexus 6. Why is he old? Why is he not good at things? I think that's the best argument against Deckard being a replicant, is he's terrible at his job.
I think there's an internal logic that would be hard to come to terms with if he is a replicant, because that obviously means Tyrell knows he's a replicant. So what is Tyrell's plan in having a replicant impose an empathy test? I think there's an internal logic that maybe you could justify, but it'd be hard to play that game.
Yeah. And it doesn't. Yeah,
but it doesn't even matter. I don't think it just doesn't matter. I like that there's ambiguity. I think I would chafe against the idea of anything definitive being said. It's just nice that it's a question.
Yeah. Well, and we're discussing this in a year where Alien Covenant came out, and we are reminded that Ridley Scott is very insistent as a filmmaker. Like, he's the guy who needs you to understand what he meant. Right. And to the point now where he's made 2 prequels because he felt people weren't asking enough questions about the space doctor in Alien. I mean, I love that no one is asking him why that's a problem. It's just become, he said this when Prometheus came out. People had questions. No one did. And that's why you're upset about it. And then he was openly saying that when Covenant came out. It's like, well, I want to expand the mythology and I want people to understand where these things came from. It's the whole point of Alien, which is a masterpiece, is that it doesn't matter. We find them, and then there's no time to worry because there are things trying to kill you all the time, and it's terrifying, and you're trapped in space with them. Blade Runner, whether Deckard is a replicant or not, I mean, I've heard alternate explanations so that the kicker bounced off Ford's eyes mistakenly and they liked it and they kept it, or they just really didn't care and they thought it was a cool new trick to use with all the actors and they didn't use it. You don't see it in Emmett Walsh's eyes because they just never got the right take. Right. And so much of it has been stitched together after the fact that to create a definitive argument for anything, as you say, is frustrating and probably unnecessary. But then 10 years later to have him come around and say, well, you people didn't notice this. I mean, obviously I had to put the unicorn dream in. It's stunning. And I'm sure he's changed his story since because, he and Lucas are just constantly rewriting their own histories and assuming people will buy them.
It is an interesting thing. I thought about, because they're very influential to me, I thought about both of them in that context and, having taken their kind of masterpieces and then created prequels to them.
Yeah, yeah.
One thing that did occur to me, related to that, is that I feel like when Ridley Scott made Blade Runner, it was this is just my interpretation, it was such a traumatic experience that it broke him. Okay. And he had a quality that he lost when he made that film, after he made that film. Right. Because the movie's strange. It just is weird. The performances are weird. The way people interact and behave it's weird, but in a really interesting way. And I think that's also partly why it feels kind of like authentically like why we're looking into the future, because it feels exotic. It doesn't feel like right now. There's just nuance to the behavior of the characters and the way things move, and the way people move and so on. That's just odd. Consciously or not, I don't know whether that was conscious or not on his part, but I feel like after that film, he desperately wanted to be accepted, and he Americanized himself, and probably maybe had to just to like be a working filmmaker and not go back to doing commercials. And so I don't think he ever made a film that. I think he's made great movies since, and I think he's a great director, but I don't think he ever made another movie that was as interesting. There's just and it's a subtle thing. Like, it's just a quality. I think it was beaten out of him. I think when he made that film, people really didn't get it, and then I know there was a lot of political complexity within the group of producers involved, and terrible. He was really treated badly, and then the film was chopped up, and all typical story.
Well, then the financial failure also.
And then it bombed.
Yeah.
It bombed hugely and got terrible reviews. So I think he was just damaged after that, and I don't think he ever. I think it changed him. I don't say he didn't recover, but it changed him.
Well, his films are increasingly after that. Yeah, they're more stylistic, but they're also more generic at the same time. Like Legend is the ultimate unicorn movie, and Black Rain is the ultimate motorcycles and samurais movie. And Thelma and Louise has a great script, which sort of he's never better than his screenplay. I find as a filmmaker, which is really frustrating because. And there's a moment in Exodus, Gods and Kings that shows you that there could have been a much, much better film in there, but he just doesn't pursue it. And then it turns into this large CG epic, which is a thing that he wants to do, that's what he's doing right now. And just never mind the other things, the other considerations. And that happens over and over in his films. And even something like Someone to Watch Over Me, which is this gorgeous looking, utterly predictable thriller, which kind of came a little too early for the erotic thriller wave of Fatal Attraction, but also came too late for a movie where Tom Berenger is in a Ridley Scott film running around expensive sets. Like, it just isn't anything, but it's polished and there's so much beehive smoke that you're probably going to get someone's going to get sick. But yeah, there's no animating principle to a lot of his films. They're just tableau. Like you get the sense that you mentioned Gilliam earlier. He's somebody I deeply adore as a filmmaker and as a person, but I know he makes movies because he wants to play in those worlds. He wants to get in there and just be on the set and be part of that universe. With Ridley Scott, he wants to build the set and then just take pictures of it. There's no activation. There's no participation.
I don't feel, to be honest, I haven't seen enough of the recent films to really intelligently comment on it.
Oh, take my word for it.
But I do think he has themes that I think he's very interested, or I take it from what his movies, that he's very interested in history and civilizations. And I think you can put him in that category of filmmaker whose work is, even though it's very eclectic in terms of the genres, he does have thematic commonality between the movies.
Sure.
But not like Terry Gilliam. Terry Gilliam is such a... And I've spent some time with him too, and I remember he used to make fun of Ridley Scott. I think a little bit because he was jealous, but he would call him, "Oh, Sir Ridley." I thought I was amazed. I was like, "You're Terry Gilliam. How can you be jealous of Ridley Scott?" Anyway, but it's interesting you brought that up, the comparison, because I think of 1984. Not 1984. What did I say? Brazil.
Right.
Sorry, I recently was thinking about or listening to a podcast about the Michael Radford 1984.
Oh, I thought you meant the Apple commercial.
But there's the Apple commercial. But it's so interesting. Yeah. So, but Brazil, I don't want to say it's an antecedent of Blade Runner, but it's obviously related because it does present a kind of retro future vision and a dystopic, totalitarian type society. So there's this link. And actually, it's interesting you brought up the very famous Apple commercial that Ridley Scott directed, which is a comment on, or a riff on Orwell's 1984. And then there was, the Michael... the
Radford production.
Radford, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Michael Radford, 1984, which is amazing, with John Hurt. And which also is kind of related to those movies as well. So it was I think something it relates to those filmmakers. They're also all based in Britain. And then there was just something in the air. Maybe it was Thatcherism or Reaganism that really was making people think about a totalitarian society.
Yeah.
And
although the exception in Blade Runner is that the totalitarianism is apparently just marketing based. Like there's no government. There's no
you don't sense of that. No,
of an oppressive structure. It's just the advertising has won, which is kind of also incredibly prescient because that's basically how it works now. Right.
Yes, as we know very well now that totalitarianism and capitalism work hand in hand.
Yeah, they come through. It comes through the media and the constant assault of off-world colony ads and products. That giant Coca-Cola spot that was so breathtaking then. Now, I mean, those billboards are real, right? Those exist.
So are the 3D ones are coming in soon too.
Yeah.
where was I going to go with this? Yeah, I guess Blade Runner, I mean, it would have taken... I think 2001 was the first that I know of science fiction film that took the notion of brands in the future.
Right.
So you had, Pan Am spaceships and so on. But then Blade Runner really did take it to another level where you see how advertising has evolved into the future. And it's significant that there's a very significant line in the film where Rachel says, "I'm not in the business, I am the business," and how humans or manufactured humans are commodities. So yeah, that movie, it just hasn't aged. It is like it could come out. In fact, I'm sure that if it had never existed and it were released this year, it would be a hit.
Yeah,
it was just clearly ahead of its time.
Yeah,
it's definitely improved with age.
It took so long to resonate. It's like what do they call those? It's not a seismic wave. It's the thing where, it's like light from space. It's a dying star that bursts out and takes 100,000 years to get to Earth. No, I'm trying to think of something like the butterfly effect, but with sound. That doesn't work. But the longevity of it has been incredible because people are still quoting it. People are excited about a new one, which again, yes, everything is coming back now and it's exhausting, but the idea that a Blade Runner sequel would be not just welcome, but feverishly anticipated, that really surprised me. I can never tell what people are going to get excited about, but the idea that there's more story to be told, specifically and with Harrison Ford, with the Deckard participating, because that would seem to answer a couple of questions.
Right.
But, I mean, I'm avoiding everything. I haven't seen the trailers. I'm avoiding all... I basically asked Villeneuve when we talked for Sicario, I guess. I just had to ask, what is there? What is there to do with Blade Runner? And I said I didn't think there would be a point. And just came right... I mean, I felt like I was comfortable enough, know each other well enough, I could just ask him, what are you doing? And all he said was, I wouldn't have made it. I was going to turn it down, and then I read Fancher's script, and I'm in. And he won't tell me anything else, which is how I want it, but it just... I still don't know why are we wholeheartedly excited over this rather than being cautiously optimistic. People are all in for Blade Runner, like it's going to correct a mistake. Like this time we all get to like it.
Oh, I see.
And that's, it's a weird place to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I love the people involved with that film. So I love Denis Villeneuve's work. I know and worked with Michael Green, who wrote the script, or was one of the writers, who's very smart. So I'm really rooting for it. Having said that, that's a tough one because...
Yeah. Well, the stakes are so high, right?
The stakes are high, and because Blade Runner is so seminal, we'll never have, even though it was a failure, we'll never have the experience of seeing that for the first time again. Right. And so what I'm just praying for is that there's a great story to be told, and then that won't matter.
Right.
And I have seen the trailer. I'm not going to comment on it. There's a lot of good stuff to be said about it.
Okay.
But I don't want to. Anyway, I don't want to say anything. I think I'm not going to formulate an opinion until I actually see the movie.
Sure. Well, but this is.
But it really has
experience it again.
No.
For the first time, you just what you said a minute ago was really has hooked into my head. If you could release it now, without any of the pretext, without foreknowledge, without familiarity, it would be a completely alien experience.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah. Can you do it again?
It's just a hard thing to walk in those shoes. That's all.
Yeah.
Because it's so iconic. I mean, the look of that film has been imitated in countless commercials and videos and movies. I mean, it's like the Road Warrior. It's one of those things that is one of the most imitated science fiction looks, designs, concepts ever, and not just in science fiction, but in all kinds of things. I had a very clever point to make, but I've entirely forgotten.
We can come back to it. I can always. I'll sweeten and tighten. Don't worry.
I'm sure it wasn't clever. Oh, I know what I was going to segue to. Ghost in the Shell.
Okay.
Did you see that?
Yes. Oh, the new one.
The new one.
Yes.
Yeah, not the original one.
So close.
But I think that's and I'm sorry because I know there's so much work that goes into those kinds of things, and I think there is a lot of good stuff in there, and I hate to be critical of someone else's work in this way, but that film illustrates why, in so many ways, why Blade Runner is so great because it tries to do the same thing and it really falls short. Yeah. There are good things in it, for sure, but I mean, I just can't imagine making, like, if you're making a sequel to Blade Runner, I guess it has to take place at night.
Yeah.
I can't imagine a scene in Blade Runner in the daylight. It just wouldn't work.
Yeah.
It wouldn't work.
The only daytime scenes really in the original are the ones that were built after the fact, of the footage from The Shining.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it leads to a whole other discussion. Mm-hmm. But before we go to that, but I think Ghost in the Shell is an interesting... I mean, it's interesting on a number of levels. One, because obviously it's this sort of odd attempt to take a really beautiful anime film and make it for a wide commercial market, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
You just can't do it. There because what makes Ghost in the Shell, that Mamoru Oshii film work, is antithetical to commercial cinema.
Yeah. Yeah.
You just can't do it.
Is.
And then you take all that out, and then you're just left with like a completely generic sci-fi action thing that you've seen 1,000 times before. And then they were paying close attention to Ghost in the Shell, but they're obviously paying close attention to Blade Runner and trying to kind of upgrade it, and it really didn't work. Like, it didn't. The upgrade was a failure. The original was much visually much more affecting and well done. And I think part of the problem for Ghost in the Shell is it takes place in daylight.
Yeah,
like it just doesn't. It had a very plasticky kind of cheap feel for that reason, and I hate saying that because I feel like there's a lot of good work in it, but
we know it when we see it. That post-production processing thing, I absolutely know what you mean. Yeah. Everything's a little gray, a little blue, and a little green, and it just doesn't need to be. And it reminds you that you're watching effects and you're watching something that's artificial. Night always works better. Well, almost always, just because we're allowed to fill in the blanks. It feels more unreal. All the way back to just, what was I thinking of? Oh, Cat People, Luton.
Right.
Just the lack of anything is actually more interesting than seeing something beautiful, fully lit, and textured if it looks like a model or a makeup or an effect when you see it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And even, that said, I thought Johansson was really good. That was a great performance physically. Like, she moves like a tank. You believe that she's not human. There's stuff in there that's interesting, but then the execution and then the larger thing with the whitewashing and the fact that there's no one Japanese there, that starts to get weird, except that there are and then there aren't, and it's just internal logic falls apart, and you just feel like every other choice was, if not wrong, then compromised. Yes. By the end of it, you're just watching a movie that you've seen a dozen times before.
Yes. I actually felt, and I know that, again, this isn't the case, and I'm sure it's the result of many cooks and studio politics, but it felt like something somebody wrote on the weekend. Yeah. It felt like somebody was half asleep when they were writing it, and I'm sure it wasn't the case. I'm sure people worked very hard on that script, but
there were a lot of writers, and when you get to that point, it has the same effect. I mean, I just saw The Mummy, and it's got 7 writers, 2 of whom are David Koepp and Christopher McQuarrie,
right?
And it's just, and there's nothing. It's. You watch it and you think, oh, okay, nobody thought about this. Or it was overthought to the point where every decision was made with the aim of making it simpler and more effective, and it just became nothing. It blands it out. It grinds it to paste.
That is, and I promise you that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
We're living in such an interesting time. Now we're going into a complete tangent, but have you watched Twin Peaks?
The series? Not all of it. No, I haven't caught up to it.
Regardless of what you think about it, it is the work of one individual, and that goes a long way.
Right.
And films, the economics of films are such that movies are so expensive now that, with very few exceptions, no one individual is allowed to make them, and it's just all becoming gray mush. Mm-hmm. And so when you watch a movie like Blade Runner, you are, even though that is a film that obviously had Hampton Fancher and David Peoples writing it, and Ridley Scott. So it was a collaboration. But you feel a singular voice in that movie, a very personal voice in that film. It's so idiosyncratic. Just the sound design, I was really taken with it. It was I listened to it with headphones on at fairly high volume, but it's very impressionistic, and it's quite, it's really avant-garde. It's actually astounding to me that film was made the same year as E.T. Like, I can't, and I love E.T. But it is, of course, people didn't understand it. It's just operating on some other level entirely. I mean, it really is. It's an art film. It's not really a piece of commercial cinema.
There is nothing in commercial cinema that can accommodate us that moment where Deckard's blood spits back into the drink. Just that image is so beautiful and so singular.
Yeah.
That's the thing that nobody has imitated. That's the thing nobody has tried for. Although I think I did see a movie where someone did the exact same shot, and I just thought, oh, fuck you. Like, I know where that's from. Stop it.
I can't... I mean, some films are so deeply embedded in my consciousness or unconsciousness that I steal from them constantly. Sometimes consciously, but mostly unconsciously, because it's just, in fact, I can't even judge the movies. Like, I can't, going back to The Shining, I can't judge that film. I love it so deeply, but I have it's too much a part of my life to have any kind of objective perspective on. And Blade Runner is really the same. Like, the sounds in that, the imagery, the way things, and the way it's cut, and the Vangelis music, it's so deeply a part of my adolescence, I guess. Really, that was a film it kind of timed perfectly with. There's a very cynical view of the world, and it kind of timed perfectly with, I guess, where my mindset was at that moment. And I'm going off.
No, this is what the show's about.
Non-linear tracks, but the other thing that struck me about it was, really, with very few exceptions, it's one of the only adult science fiction films that where there's no trace of pulp in it whatsoever. I mean, there's
like pandering or
and nothing. If it's a very I mean, it's quirky in some ways, but it's very serious, and it really it's not trying to entertain you. I don't feel like at any moment there's the filmmaker or the writer saying, "Oh, the audience will laugh at this."
Right.
In fact, I almost feel like sometimes it's a conscious attempt to go the other way, to like just say, let's do this, they'll completely confuse them. It reminds me, it's a particular kind of flavor of science fiction that feels so European, and I know Ridley Scott was heavily influenced by heavy metal and by Moebius, and there's a very famous Moebius comic written by Dan O'Bannon called The Long Tomorrow.
Okay. Do
you know of this?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. I think that's the name. Long Tomorrow, and it's Blade Runner. It's except it's not Philip K. Dick, and the city, the design is absolute, and I'm sure consciously Ridley Scott borrowed from it. It is Blade Runner, and it's a policier kind of mystery in, maybe it's New York or somewhere in the future, like a multi-tiered city. It's a particularly European vibe, and I think the other film that comes to mind that has a similar quality is Stalker, the Tarkovsky movie. That there are very few science fiction films that have that flavor. Yeah, it's truly unique that way.
I'm trying to think of any others. I mean, there's La Jetée, I guess, which is more experimental than narrative, even, so it doesn't quite line up with it. Or there's a Renee film that's more in line with Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind than anything else.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Screened at TIFF a few years ago, and I saw it theatrically for the first time, and it's like, wow, this is actually serious-minded science fiction. Or Fahrenheit 451, the Truffaut version, but they're all still very clearly locked in the European mindset of a serious attempt to understand this literary thing.
Right, they're deeply philosophical, and where nobody has a shred of humor. A shred of a sense of humor.
And then into the Blade Runner construction, you inject Rutger Hauer, who is an incredibly alive performer in this movie in a way that I don't think he is in anything. I mean, maybe a handful of other movies
Right.
he could be that snappy, but this film just, it idolizes him. It's in love with him, which is, again, the thing you can't do with the original Dick conception of the replicants as uninteresting and emotionless and machine people. He's not that. He's so clearly alive that it changes the dynamic, and it makes Deckard look more like a replicant by comparison, because he's very quiet and still, and in a way that Ford really hadn't been up until that point. And Howard is just so vivid.
Yeah.
You know, he's enjoying everything. He smiles through his death. It doesn't matter. Like, he's completely in the moment as an actor in a way that nobody else in the film is.
Yeah, and he's the Superman. Like, you feel like he's more evolved than a human.
Yeah.
And he's the Ubermensch. He's magnificent. The film is brilliantly cast. I mean, really perfectly cast. I don't think there's... I can imagine anyone in any one of those other roles. It's very strange to me that Harrison Ford almost disowned the movie, and it really is, one of his best performances. There's no question.
Yeah.
He has such a great quality. And everyone's wardrobe is so great. And which is a very hard thing to do in a science fiction film. Like, even, or in an 80s movie. It's very much a movie of its time, but there's something utterly timeless about the wardrobe. Nothing looks remotely dated, and Sean Young looks unbelievable in that film.
I think for her, I mean, at least they've got the ability to create new looks. Those clothes never existed before. They're not retro. They're just they're retro in their elaborateness. You think of the stuff Lauren Bacall wore in The Big Sleep, but you're not really connecting eras with her. She is. Everybody else is wearing clothes that look like they've been either vintaged or repurposed or scored to look older. But she's just she's immaculate. The clothing constructions are insanely busy and complicated, but her stillness serves them.
Totally.
Like, Rachel can wear this stuff because she's not going to shrug it off. It's worn.
She has she moves in a certain way. There's this one, I don't know if you remember it, but there's this one shot where she's about to have the Voight Kampff test, and she's reaching for a cigarette, and she does this thing.
The swivel. Yeah.
She does this and it's really elegant, and it's almost dance-like. It's really interesting.
Yeah, only the upper half of her body.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The whole I really love, like, I know it's like Apocalypse Now. It's a film where I know critics were divided about it, and even now I just don't see what's wrong with it. I just think it's great. It's all great, and I feel the same thing about Blade Runner. I mean, I don't. It was, especially looking at it. I feel like every time I see it, I like it more. Watching it. The other day, I was just really taken with how magnificent it is and how singular it is in terms of the way it deals with theme. Like, it really, I think that's what probably threw people for a loop is it's so much about what it means to be human and about how we're only here for a limited amount of time, and you know what? You don't really encounter that in a traditional detective story.
Yeah.
It's just its own thing.
And that's weird too, because those films are always steeped in somebody dying and death and chasing and a ticking clock. The clock in Blade Runner is ticking so quietly that we're sort of surprised when it's finally revealed that Batty is done.
Right.
It doesn't feel like it because he was so vital. And just a second ago, jumping over buildings and everything, it seems wrong in a way that makes it instantly unconsciously human, because of course it's wrong. It's never time.
Right.
And why he's not... You see there's this weird neuromuscular thing that's going on throughout the movie with him, and he's twitching, and he crucifies himself in order to keep focused, but he still looks amazing. Like, you're not going... He's not... I mean, like, my concern now is that someone will digitally turn somebody into goo or something. They'll just fall apart when you reach the end of your... I mean, I definitely remember... Oh, there's a couple of shows that have done that, just conceptually with their expiring of characters. But you don't get it here. Here, it's actually tragic to watch this perfect specimen finish.
Right.
And that's as good a metaphor for humanity as literally anything else ever.
Yeah.
And so, of course, people keep coming back to it. That Tears in Rain speech, which doesn't make sense because it's not supposed to. We aren't allowed to understand what he's referencing because he was there and we weren't.
Right.
Which is, again, the death of memory. That's what happens when you go. All the stuff is lost.
Right.
And then you see somebody like Daryl Hannah, again, an incredible physical specimen in the film, celebrated for her movement, dying spasmodically ugly. Right? She doesn't die well, and it's awful.
Yeah.
Or what happens with Johnny Cassidy, who, I mean, I don't think anybody can really... Anybody who wasn't there the first time through doesn't remember how jarring it was to watch that stuntman shot.
Oh, yeah.
Because it was wrong. Like, you could see the body was wrong. It was obviously a man's build wearing women's clothing. But that actually worked at the time because it felt wrong, too. Like you were watching something go terribly wrong.
Right. Yeah, never... I noticed it, but it never troubled me. It's funny with these things,
Even what should be the bad choices support the story somehow.
This is the magic of cinema, and why I do feel like the temptation for people like George Lucas to go in and retool his films is so misguided, because I love the movies because of their flaws, and I think when a film is truly great and it's kind of hit that note that is just so correct, that even when you see the wires or the tape in the background, that in a way only it's like, you love your husband or your wife because of their foibles.
Sure, yeah.
As much as the things that they do perfectly, and I really feel like and you can't separate them, is the thing, that they're intrinsically combined to make this person you love. The same thing with the movie. So yeah, no, that never felt wrong, and it was interesting, thinking about. Of course, people were put off by the film because their last memory of Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones was shooting people in this glorious way that was exciting and thrilling and adventurous. And when he shoots anybody in this film, it is ugly.
Yeah. And
he feels really bad, and we feel really badly. I mean, when he shoots Pris, he almost looks like he's vomiting, and you feel that way. It's like he's how it feels to really kill an animal. It's a horrible, ugly, brutal act. And the film's very truthful. I guess it feels like it's really captured something that's like any great work of art should, truthful to the human condition. And I appreciate the fact that Deckard is a deeply flawed hero, and that the replicants are, they're cruel as well.
Yeah.
I mean, Batty kills poor Sebastian. J.S. Sebastian was helping him, his sweet little guy. He murders him.
Yeah. Oh, and Leon's an asshole.
And Leon's an asshole.
He really is not a good person.
There's nobody in the film that is, except maybe Rachel, who is admirable, but she's a victim,
and she's literally an innocent.
And she's an innocent.
She's completely unaware of anything and has no agency in her own life.
That's right.
To the point where she doesn't even get, or in the original concept, well, not the original conception, but in the 1982 release, she doesn't even get to choose her own destiny, because she goes off to live forever with a human person,
right?
Which then got retconned,
right,
in 92, and then is now. I mean, just the fact that they cut that piece of footage and left it on the ambiguous closing of the elevator doors is fantastic.
No, okay, so this is a good segue. So now, how do you feel about the original version versus the subsequent director's cut?
The 82 theatrical, the first version. I think it's weird that the narration was never intention. I think it's weird that it was conceived without narration, because those long shots now seem weird without it. Even though I know it wasn't originally designed, the narration does kind of work in 82.
And now, I might be wrong about this, but I think they did always intend to have narration.
Oh, so just not...
They had always intended it, but they never... I just don't think they ever found... They literally never got the text that they were satisfied with, and they were probably, I'm surmising, compensating for issues that they were having with how the film tested and people's comprehension of it by overwriting the narration. But my understanding was that had always been the plan, that there would be this Chandler-esque narration.
So then rather than re-record new narration or come up with something he wanted, he just lifts it out of 92.
He just pulled it out. That's what I believe is the case.
Okay.
I hope I'm not wrong. Someone's going to...
It does make sense. Well, I mean, that's the beauty of Blade Runner. There are so many versions that there is no right or wrong anymore. There's only what the final cut was then and what it is now and what it's going to be next fall, I guess, when he decides for the DVD and Blu-ray release of Blade Runner 2049 and he wants to go back and do something else to it. But I don't know. I mean, I know I wasn't wholly satisfied in 82. And I was a kid, so I questioned my own responses. I mean, I always knew it was very, very slow and deeply in love with itself. But that's not a problem. It's marveling at the world. It's not marveling at its invention. And the 92 version clarified a lot of the things that I was kind of picky about. But again, you're not seeing it for the first time. So any film you see a second time... I watched Life Force again last night. Just after The Mummy, realizing that it's the same story. Like, it really is. And started thinking, if I'm going to start yelling about this on Twitter, I should really take another look at Life Force and be better informed. But it really is.
I love Life Force.
Life Force is... you know what? It is exactly what I remember. But it doesn't feel as insane anymore because I'm used to it. The breathlessness of it and the way that it just
Talk about a film that was ahead of its time.
Yeah, it just keeps adding new ideas, and there's zombies, and there's this, and there's the... Let's go set... the entire second act is set in a mental hospital that we never revisit, and it doesn't really matter. And it really is nuts. But it doesn't feel as crazy because I know the story, and I know the pace and the tone. It's already internalized.
Right.
So coming back to Blade Runner, any repeat viewing is going to be about appreciating what you know is there rather than, oh, that's weird. You never have that disconnect again. So in 92 when it came back and I saw it at the... In fact, where did they screen it for us? It was at TIFF, the 92 restoration. And I saw it at, I want to say, the Elgin maybe? Or the Sheraton? It was a press screening, but it was hastily organized by Warner. They just slapped it in a 10 a.m. slot, and we all saw it early. Either just before the festival or as the festival was starting. And it was completely the wrong atmosphere to see that movie in because everything is so breathless and you're seeing 5 films a day. But to start the day off with the film was great because it put you in that dream state right away.
Right.
And knowing the pace of it, I could just sit there and really watch and look for the things that were different and experience that. And so that experience of the film is probably my single best one because I've never paid closer attention to it.
How interesting.
Even the first time through.
Right.
And so I think as a result I prefer the 92 cut, but then the 97 or 98 version, the sweetened version with the digital fixes for Joanna Cassidy's sequence, and the sound mix is, I think, very different, but in really subtle ways. There's a sense of tone and space that's different, and the music echoes differently. That one is probably the one I've watched at home the most since VHS, since the olden days. Right. But I still don't know if I have a favorite version. Probably the 92 Experience is my favorite one. But
It's an interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know if it's an improvement.
I can't tell. Like I do miss the narration. Having said that, I haven't heard it in a really long time. So if I heard it now, I might cringe. But I do miss it, and I even miss them driving away because I feel like the film's so oppressive in a good way. But it's so you're just in darkness the whole film, and then you go out into the great wilderness, the great light bright. Outdoors, and that just is a nice denouement. Like I never had a problem with the I know it was a reshoot or something they shot, not a reshoot, but something they added on later. I never really had a problem with that, and there's something cathartic about it.
I guess for me it was just the knowledge that they have flying cars that they can't hide. And not in an ironic way, but I was just that I was expecting a spinner to come over the shop somehow, or just the sense of the chase continuing. Whereas in the 92 cut, when the doors close, because I didn't know how they had resolved it at the time, you're thrown out of the film. Right. You're just pushed out. It's over.
Right. Yeah.
And it's jarring and weird, and I think what I'm supposed to feel.
Right.
Just because that race to the elevator, they look at each other, the doors slam closed, and boom, you're done.
Right.
That I really like. And I think that's why I'm resisting a sequel in my brain, because I don't want to know what happened next, and they're going to have to tell me.
Right. Yes, this is a thorny thing.
Yeah.
I know.
Right? There's that conflict between having a perfect thing and then expanding, building an addition onto it.
It's funny, we're in this time where people just want to know everything, and, they want to build a Blade Runner theme park, no doubt, after that. And
Sure. Oh, the void count test would be amazing. That's how you get to choose which part of the experience you have to take a test, and then it decides which ride you get. You're just going to be lifting things. Sorry.
yeah. It's interesting. But I mean, I had the same issue, and have the same issue with the Star Wars movies. I just don't want to know.
Yeah.
First of all, I don't really care, and then whenever I find out what it is, I'm disappointed or angry.
It's funny, there's a moment in The Force Awakens that I love that nobody else did, which is when you find out what Kylo Ren's name is. Just when Harrison Ford, again, the icon of his era, calls him Ben, I was sure it was going to be Anakin. And it wasn't, and I'm like, oh, I got surprised. That's actually better. It makes more sense, because Leia would have named him, and Leia was closer to, like, she wouldn't want to name him for the father who murdered her mother and all that stuff, because she knew him.
Right.
She knew Darth Vader as Darth Vader. She never knew him as Anakin Skywalker. Right. So of course she wouldn't. But I thought that would be the big flourish of the ending, to say that all of this has happened before and all this is happening again, and it's a generational story about family that can't solve their own problems. And having it be Ben was a moment where I realized, that's right, I don't own this property. I can't make it do what I want it to do.
Right.
So that's the experience that everybody gets all the time now, because people are taking these sequels and properties and reconfiguring them. And it's, you're right. I don't want the thing that I want to have any more to it than I like. Right? I don't need it to do that.
I like movies that bleed out around the edges, where you feel like there's more there, but I don't want to know what that more is.
Yeah.
I really don't. I mean, my Star Wars exception to that rule would be in Rogue One. I was very impressed by their explanation for why the rebels were able to, spoiler alert, penetrate the Death Star and destroy it. Like, that was, they improved
how the plans got to be.
Yes, why that flaw was built into the Death Star.
Right. Yeah, that was great.
That was actually, because that, it always seemed like a terrible oversight on the part of the Empire, that they would have this exhaust port that would give you access to the reactor in the center of the Death Star, and you could destroy it with one photon torpedo. But now that's been explained quite cleverly.
Yeah.
So that would be the one exception. But as a rule, yes, I just don't want to know. And I like endings where the character, like the end of The Graduate. Like, I really don't want the sequel to The Graduate. Please do not show me. And I know there was a book sequel, but I don't want to know what happened to those people, because I know it'll only depress me.
Right. Even if it's the ending you want it to be, then it's going to be mundane, because you can imagine it.
Let them just go away on the bus, and we don't want to hear from them again.
All right. But that does bring us to the final question, which is, what of Blade Runner has influenced you, or you've already kind of said it, but is there anything of the film specifically that's made it into your own creative DNA?
There's just the blanketing effect that it's had, which really probably has to do with my entire perception of reality. But honestly, I mean, to me, the movies that are the most successful are the ones that don't stop when I leave the theater. Literally, when I walk out of the movie theater, I feel like I'm still within the movie, and the filmmaker's vision is so powerful that it's skewed my own personal vision of the world. And I remember having that experience with Blade Runner, and I'm sure that's sort of rippled through my entire life. I think aesthetically, it's really a perfect movie, and it's something that I could only aspire to. And I made this obscure film a long time ago called Cypher, and there was a scene that takes place in this vault, and it was my Blade Runner scene. It was my Ridley Scott Blade Runner tribute scene, because I had a big fan in it. Lots of smoke.
I'm telling you, smoking fans is a thing with them.
But I really think it's the tone of the movie. The film feels like a window into a world and a visual window and an oral window that is so powerful and immersive. And I've seen it so many times that it really has just infiltrated the way I look at movies and the way I make films. And I believe that it is a high watermark. I don't think it has to be the top 10 most aesthetically pleasing and powerful films ever made. So in that regard, I know it's influenced me. And I just hope one day I make a science fiction film that has that degree of depth and that kind of prescient impact.
Yeah. Where would you go? Like, what theme could even? Do you have any kind of sense of what would constitute a film that big for you? Like, where your mind goes?
Well, my mind goes to some big places, but those ones are really hard to get made. So I end up making movies in one room mostly. But they're influenced by Blade Runner 2, and for sure. And I think that the scale isn't just the sets and the visual effects. It's the scale of the ideas, and that actually Blade Runner. It occurred to me watching it again. It's quite an intimate film. There aren't a lot of, particularly for a detective story. There aren't a lot of characters.
Right.
There aren't even a lot of locations. I mean, there are a number, but there aren't a tremendous amount. And it's quite, the climax of the movie is just two guys in an apartment climbing onto a roof. Yeah. So that wouldn't fly today. Like, you would not end your big budget science fiction film that way in today's world. So that supersized kind of mentality isn't really at play in Blade Runner, and I definitely subscribe to that, and I'll never be permitted to work on that level anyway. So I think that, I think that's something I would continue to aspire to. But it's a tonal thing. I really just like I guess my sort of overtly science fiction films, Cube and Splice, they're fairly, they're eclectic, I guess, but there is some serious intent. And like all great science fiction films, Blade Runner is fundamentally about the human condition. That's just it.
Yeah.
And it's just it's becoming hard to make science fiction films because reality is eclipsing all the popular science fiction notions that we grew up with. I mean, Blade Runner, we're kind of living in a Blade Runner world right now. For some reason we still don't have flying cars, although I know that's being worked on.
Yeah.
And so really the challenge is to come up with the next iteration, to actually look beyond that vision. And I don't think it's an easy thing to do. I don't know that anyone has really done it recently. I feel like science fiction films are becoming increasingly retro in terms of being callbacks to other movies and dated science fiction concepts. There really hasn't been one, maybe since Inception, that I felt like I was seeing something that was new.
Right.
I feel like...
And Inception went out of its way to not be science fiction, to be contemporary and recognizable, and steal its imagery from other genres, even like Bond
That's a good
films
point.
And things like that.
Yeah, I think so. I think part of one of the challenges with science fiction now is that really technology is becoming invisible. I think that's the real future of technology, is that you just won't see it. It's not going to be. We're not going to be hardware obsessed in the future, so it's kind of dull. It's not particular.
Yeah.
It's not particularly cinematic.
Well, right? Spike Jonze's film. That's the one, or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which is dealing with sci-fi concepts, but grounding them in mundane reality.
Absolutely. And where Her's a perfect example, where it's about the supercomputer, but you don't see anything. It's just a voiceover. And actually, I liked Her a lot. I think that is, if we were thinking about what the real future is, that's more where we're headed. And it's hard to give up on spaceships and flying cars because they're fun.
Yeah. And you want them. Maybe we'll get that with Valerian.
Yeah, Valerian, you're going to get that in spades. But it's you're going to get everything.
But it's space opera. It's not related to humanity.
It's fantasy, I'm sure, as much as it is science fiction.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Let's have some flying cars.
Yeah,
flying cars
exactly.
without guilt. That's what I want.
When you think about Fifth Element, right? What that was to, obviously, to Blade Runner, but no, again, and it was its own thing. It was very charming, but Blade Runner got it right. You can't beat it.
My thanks to Vincenzo Natali, who's currently working on a relaunch of Tremors for Sci-Fi. I have to admit, I'm awfully curious to see how that turns out. Until then, maybe you can catch up to Cube or Splice when you get the chance, and check out his lesser-known films, Cypher and Nothing, if you catch them kicking around anywhere. You can also find his most recent work in the first seasons of American Gods and Westworld, arriving on Blu-ray and DVD October 17th and November 7th from Anchor Bay and HBO, respectively. You can find Vince on Twitter at Vincenzo_Natali, and you can find Blade Runner on Blu-ray, DVD, and 4K from Warner Home Entertainment in multiple configurations with some really impressive supplements. And it's also available on iTunes and Google Play, but come on, go big. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Norm Wilner, and elsewhere on the internet at nowtoronto.com. You can also find this podcast on Twitter at Semcast, SEMcast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. If you want to leave a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or whatever, that would be greatly appreciated. It's too bad more people don't do that. But then again, who does? Thanks for listening.
I'm afraid you're just too darn loud.